My name is Kריסטיאן Baden. I'm a Chavis at the Department of Communication and Journalism at the Hebrew University. And I came to the Hebrew University almost 6 years ago, initially with a Marie Curie grant. And then from there, applied to become a member of the department and of the university. And I have been before that traveling around a little bit academically. So like I did my PhD at the University of Amsterdam. I work on meaning making and communication, discourse dynamics, meaning dynamics, contestation, and mostly everything that is unfriendly about it. So like propaganda, conspiracy theories, everything that's nasty, I like that. And I've been, after being in Amsterdam, I went to the University of Munich, Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, for almost 4 years, working mostly on conflict communication, conflict news, and then got there into a project which eventually got me to here, what got me first in contact with the colleagues at the Hebrew U, and then got me into the idea of actually going to the Hebrew University, and eventually then they got me here. So I've been working in quite a few countries so far. I've been seeing a few systems, and I've now also been a bit of on different sides of these entire decisions that have to do with postdocs, both on the side of actually trying to find one and make something out of it. And I made a number of mistakes that I found instructive. And also on the other side as like a part of projects that actually employed postdocs or that kind of advertised positions of different kinds. And I thought that there may be like a few things that I might add to the presentation that I gave 2 years ago that might be useful. And for that, I'm going to quickly share you a few extra slides. Okay, so this is basically where I ended last in this presentation, that I basically said, you know, like if you want to go abroad, if you want to do a postdoc, the key thing is to understand what really are you aiming for, what do you want to do, and there are a lot of things that you can do in this process that are all useful. But what is important if you want to actually get this done, if you want to get your postdoc to be successful, it's really important to keep track of a bunch of things, like for instance documenting what you're doing, being able to show successes, being able to show performances of different kind. And I thought this is a little bit incomplete, so I decided to add 3 slides here. And the first slide that came out of this was a little bit of an outcome of an observation that I made from a number of applications that we got for a project in which I am currently involved together with Karen Tenenbaum-Weinblatt at the Department of Communication, where we got a bunch of applications for postdoc positions. And one thing that is striking is what people do with the winding road that normally leads you forward. Like, you know, like if you apply for things, if you tell your own story, it is never a straight road, right? Like you always have had these things that you did somewhere on the way that kind of like you did them for reasons that are no longer relevant, or you kind of did them for reasons that have nothing to do with research. You needed the money, you didn't have like another option or whatever. So, but basically every CV is full of these bends and detours where it's not entirely clear like why they are there, and they're basically there are some better and some not so good ways of dealing with this. So this is I thought like talk like for a few minutes about like what you can do to well, basically to tell your story to a committee of people who might want to hire you, to a person who is advertising a postdoc, but also just, you know, to your grandmother. That's the same problem to some extent. And one of the things that I always found very useful is something that my supervisor told me a while ago, and that is that the important thing is for everything that you do is like, how did this help me get where I was? And then there are some kind of contributions that are important because they actually gave you access to something that is useful, and some other things are not important. So like, instead of kind of looking at your CV or looking at your project that brought you here as like, and then I did this, and then I did that, and I also did this, and kind of arranging everything like in a sequential order, what is much more useful is to start to think of this as basically all the things that you've done as, well, basically as building blocks of what you can do today, right? Like basically, these can be substantive building blocks, like you learned methods, you learned theoretical approaches, you tested experience, you gained field experience, you gained experience in working with, you know, like whatever, with research in a project, in a research, with research assistant. Like, you normally take something away. And if you tell the story this way, basically not in terms of what you did when, but what skills you acquired in what kind of stages of your previous process, this makes a much nicer story. It also has the side effect that some things kind of fall under the table because you didn't acquire any skills in them. And I think that for like a talk, that's completely okay. Right? Like basically, if you want to introduce yourself and say what you're doing, what you have been doing, this is not about giving a complete account of everything you have ever done. And also in a CV, there are some things that are completely fine if you leave them out because they have no interest. They don't contribute in any particular way to the story. And instead, kind of to think about this in terms of like, how can I use all the things that I have done in order to convey to those people I'm talking to what I can do. So like, just as an example, for instance, if I'm when I was applying for the staff position in the Hebrew University, a lot of the kind of past little studies or different things I did not really address as things in their own right because they're not interesting in their own right. But what I did mention is that, for instance, that I do have some experience working with think tanks and like, you know, with independent researchers, policy-oriented research. And what I did mention is that they have like a lot of international experience, and then you can just kind of list the things that go there. And that makes it much easier to kind of present all this winding road as if it was actually like it will never become a straight road, right? It just won't. But what it can become is it can be a systematic effort to cover the ground of everything that you needed to know, right? Like, for instance, if you come to the conclusion that for a postdoc that you're applying to, one of the skills that you want to get across that you really have is that you're good at integrating theoretical perspectives. But then talk about how you're doing this and kind of refer to those 3 projects, which may be in completely different stages of your life, where this was something that you actually did, which is super useful both for you because it makes out of a sudden makes things seem reasonable and like purposeful that you never thought about as reasonable and purposeful in this moment when you did it. But they're also useful for the people you're talking to, because if they then want to know, like, what do you mean by integrating research findings or whatever, they know which of the publications from your list to pull and to look into and say, am I impressed by this? Do I like this? Is this nicely done? Right? And the same way, if you want to get across, say, for instance, that you have a lot of teamwork experience, then and you refer to this stuff, the projects where you gathered this, then the same thing goes, that basically I know where I could ask, who I could ask to see, to get more information here, right? Like basically the key story here being, don't tell the winding road that got you here in terms of enumerating the bends. Nobody cares, and it mostly confuses people, but tell it in terms of the kind of the growth, your growth, like the things which this did for you. Then you kind of can build a story about which is kind of rich about what you can do, and then you get into the next problem. Let's see if I can actually flip to the next page. Yes. If you climb that winding road, then, and this is something I kind of alluded to in the presentation that I did 2 years ago. Like the second really important part of your story, if you want to sell your project, if you want to sell yourself and kind of convey to people, you know, you have this postdoc position, you have this job for me, you have whatever, and you want me, is to convey a really clear sense of what do I have. And that's something that I have to say, I have seen way too many applications, even from postdoctoral researchers, that couldn't formulate that. And that's really, really useful. Like basically, if you are capable of phrasing in 2, 3 pristine sentences, what is it that you can do that is valuable here in the context of whatever you're applying for? What is like, what distinguishes you? In what way do you think, do you have something that is that probably other people who are applying do not have? Don't just say like, you know, I'm a whatever something researcher and I have done this and I have done this, but kind of give it a weight. Decide what like what is kind of your main argument, the main point. Like if you imagine basically the committee or the people who want to employ you retreating after having met you, what is the key argument that you want them to bring up in your favor, right? Like, but she has this, this kind of sentence. You want to say that sentence. You want to have the sentence in the cover letter if you apply for anything. And that doesn't mean that this is always going to be the same sentence. This depends on who you're talking to and what others have. So also something I already alluded to in the other presentation, it helps immensely if you know who you have before you. Like if you know that you are in the room with 5 people and 3 of them are working on something and they have a specific expertise, and 2 others, they're doing something that is kind of similar to what you're doing, kind of positioning yourself within the group where you are, right? These people around you, what is in this group? If you imagine you already had the job, what do you have? Where is your emphasis? And how does this complement what others have? And how does this enable them to do something else, right? Which means, of course, that you need to be sometimes a little bit careful. Like, for instance, before I applied in the Hebrew U, there were a bunch of colleagues who came to me and told me all things I should not mention as what I have, because I shouldn't step on people's feet, right? If you come as a freshly minted PhD, and then there is this committee with this big name in whatever, some kind of field, and you out of a sudden come and say like, and I'm an authority on this thing, right? This doesn't go well, because the senior person will not appreciate that now you are trying to claim their position, which is not what you should do, of course. What you should do is to be aware of who is in the room, or like as much as is possible, and kind of try and show how what you are doing is different from what those people are doing, but adds to it, right? Like this kind of connection. This is super useful. And that kind of leads to the third point. Where do I stand? There's a kind of a thin line between overselling and underselling, right? Like there's like, on the one hand, when you come out of the PhD, you kind of add you know a crazy amount of stuff about your specific experience, and you have a very strong sense, hopefully, of why this is cool. But at the same time, you're doing a postdoc or you're going on in order to continue to grow. So like you don't want to come across as the one who kind of like, you know, stopped learning, who's already done it all. But what you want to do is you want to come across as somebody who has already acquired an important set of skills, an important brick in the entire story, and who has a clear vision of what the next bricks will have to be and how the other people in the room can both benefit from what you already have and can help you with their expertise to acquire the next 3 things that you really need, right? So this is kind of this give and take. So if you can say, even like possibly directly addressing people who are there, right? Like that may be in a cover letter, that may be in an actual interview. Like it's like, yeah, I'm very much aware of your research that you did on this kind of thing, and I think like if you combine this with the stuff that I'm doing, there is some very fascinating story that we could develop here, right? Or saying, and this kind of problem that I ran into in my research reminds me of something that I found in your research, and I thought maybe this is something, if you're interested, I would be totally fascinated to go into this. Right? This is a way of kind of conveying that you are aware who you are talking to and willing to exchange, to contribute. You are no longer in a position of like this kind of like, you know, you're not asking for alms or for mercy. You bring something to the table, but you're also asking to become part of a team. You're asking to become part of a group where people interact and they learn from one another. So if you can convey already how that might look, that makes a super strong point, right? Like if in the cases that I've seen so far, those postdocs that I've seen who applied, who could give me a clear sense of what they aim to grow, how they aim to develop themselves in this process, and how this develops based on what they already have and what I can offer them. This makes a strong case, right? Because I can see what is going to happen. Which gets me to the last slide, if it then loads, is basically how to present this. And this is kind of similar to the overall drift of the talk about the Marie Curie and the related options that I talked about in the video. But basically like how to put the emphasis on what you are doing and what you're not doing. And I think the key here is that you need 3 things to convey how you want this to continue. You need to have like a big goal, something. This is like what you have and what you want to do. This is your quest, right? Like the thing where you think, okay, this is like 10 years, 20 years down the road. I want to have made major progress toward understanding, explaining this. This is the far goal. Nobody, and literally nobody, expects you to know how you will get there. But what you do need is you do need a clear sense of the next few steps. Like what are you going to do in the next year, in the next 2 years, when you do this postdoc? What exactly are these steps and how do they get you closer to this goal? Like you want to propose something where it is easy for people to understand how what you're proposing as the next steps is not only building on what you already have done, but it also gets you toward that far goal that you have. And that's also important, an awareness of what major waypoints will have to be for this in the future. So like kind of showing that you're not just thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, like I want to do this study on, I did this thing on Israel, and now I want to do this on Canada, and I want, because it's different and it's interesting, but you need to think beyond this, like where will this get you? What could be the next project after the one that you're currently planning? What could be the next, like, you know, if you, for instance, if you're applying for a postdoc, what could be the project which you then submit as a grant proposal while you're doing your postdoc? What could be the thing that you start a staff position with? What is the kind of the next, I wouldn't say like the next big thing, but the next important waypoint beyond the thing that you're currently planning to do? So if you can specify these 3 things, a distant goal that you have a clear vision of, even though you have no clue how to get there, a number of steps where you already know what to do, you already have an idea, you may have already started, doesn't matter, that's not important. What's important is that it's clear. You convey, I know what I'm doing here, and if basically, if you give me this money, I will do this with you and this will be so nice. But if you don't give me this money, I will do this anyway, because this is what I do. And then the major waypoint, which gives the perspective of that you can continue on this. So if you have, and that goes for any kind of narrative, right? That goes, if you have this in a written application for something, if you have this in an interview talk, if you have this when you're trying to convey to your grandmother that you're doing cool stuff, if you can say like, what have I already done? What am I going to do next? What is the thing that this contributes to? And could there be major further steps? Everybody will understand what is the thing that you bring to the table. And if you can then network this with what the other people in the room are doing, then they can understand what might be their role in your growth and your role in their further growth. And this makes a very strong story. So I'm not saying you always will be able to do this neatly, but like if you keep these kind of things as a bit of a thought in the back of your head, and when you write letters, when you plan talks, you make sure that you keep inside this talk somewhere a reference to what is the overall goal, what is this really about, and you keep a reference to something that could follow after the study you're currently talking about. If you've kind of phrased this in such a way, it will be so much clearer, so much stronger. And last sentence, it will also help you understand better what you are doing, because one does get lost in the stage and kind of just shifts projects around a little bit depending on what comes up your alley. So if in your application for postdocs, in your application for staff positions, in your applications for grants, in your talks, in whatever, you kind of keep these things in mind, it will be much harder for you to get lost on the way. And that is, of course, what we all hope. I've talked already way too much with this kind of talk before, so I'll leave it at this here and be very happy to take any questions that you may have. Okay, I got a private message from one of participants. Is this okay if I speak about this in the group?
Sure.
Yeah. Like basically the question is like, if we have to have a competitive advantage that differentiates us from others, but still complements what others are doing, how do we identify this? I think the key thing which probably helps is to think of your competitive advantage not necessarily as one particular thing, but as a capacity that you bring somehow. So, like for instance, like if you're a researcher with a specific, like you work in a specific field, you know a lot about this field, but you will probably never know more about this field. Like you cannot plausibly claim that you are now the authority on this field, especially if there is somebody who's authoritative in the room, right? So you can't really do this. So what you can claim is you can say, okay, like I bring a specific perspective. There is like some aspect of this problem where I have more experience. Like that does not mean that like basically it does not you don't need to diminish what anybody else knows in order to say like I'm adding something to this which has an important contribution. That can be that there is a specific case that you know much more about and this case has potential, but then you have to explain how knowing something about this case will enable you to contribute things that others can't just obviously do. If it's something you know, like for instance, stupid example, I was working together with a friend at the Department of Communication who is also a very smart researcher, but one competitive advantage that he has is that because he is a former Haredi and he really understands this community, he is capable of doing research in an environment where most of us cannot. Even like we don't have access, even if we don't have access, even if we do have access, we don't necessarily understand what the heck is going on. So he has access to a research field which is super interesting, super rich, and basically when you then can explain why it is interesting to look at this case, what we can learn from this, you got a comparative advantage, right? or like it might be that it's kind of some tool that you have experience with, or maybe it's part of your network. You bring in an expertise from elsewhere. Your competitive advantage is not necessarily always the thing that is at the center stage of what you're doing. It is the thing that distinguishes what you are doing from that which the others are doing and makes it worthwhile, never like the thing that is not redundant, but adds insights. And that does not have to be a huge thing. What is important is that it is a valuable thing. Something where you can explain how this is useful, right? I hope this answered to some extent the question. Okay, I see in the chat, Yuval asked, could you give some directions to making good plan for the postdoc period? What do you mean by good plan? You mean like basically a strategy for work, or for like where to go, or can you maybe say a thing more about this, Yuval?
After I got accepted to a postdoc, yeah. I think I should make a plan for 1 or 2 years of what are the goals, what are my objectives that I need to achieve in order to be in a good position in a year and a half when I go to the job market or to the next postdoc position. Yeah. So what I'm wondering is, what would be a good a way to make this plan?
I would probably think of 2 or 3 things. I would think of, one thing is the question of what you are doing now, like these kind of next steps. Like you have, like if you got the thing, you probably already have some kind of plan of what you want to do. So there is some kind of proposal. So the key thing that is open about planning about the next steps is, what are you going to do with this, right? Like, is this supposed to become 2 articles? Is this supposed to become like at the beginning of a book? Like, what is this supposed to end up in? Right? So that's kind of one important thing. You're currently working on something, and part of the plan needs to be to have a clear vision of what you want to do with that thing that you are working. The second thing that is very useful to keep in mind is like, what will have to follow after that. So basically, since the postdoc is a transition period, right? It's basically, you can't, I guess you can stay in a postdoc for a long time, but it's not a good idea, right? So the question is like, and then what? And in this and then what may mean a number of different things, right? It might, depending on your position, it might mean that you get ready to submit a grant application, right? This is kind of the next major waypoint. So like, while you are working on what you're working now, what is the next step that you would like to prepare? It could be that you're trying to get ready and make yourself attractive for a staff position somewhere. It might be that you are getting ready to join a team of people or a network or something like this. But basically having an idea of what you want to do after this postdoc, and then think from this backward, what do I need in order to make it likely that this will actually work? Which may mean that you may need to emphasize networking and collaborating with people and kind of strengthen your ties with those people. For instance, if you want to get a staff position, that's something I would strongly recommend, that you start networking with the people where you want to apply. That may mean that you need to get experience in some particular, like maybe grant writing, that you might want to do a few workshops about how to do this. But something like basically thinking backward from the plan after to what does this mean that I need to do while I'm doing my postdoc. And that's kind of the third thing I would think about. Also, like, what do I want to learn during this time? What skills do I want to acquire? And those don't necessarily have to be super, you know, kind of advanced and abstract skills. This can be something like, you know, I want to work on my my skills in giving workshops, right? Or I want to train English professional writing so I don't need a language editor. But like getting a sense of what are things that I currently don't really have as skills as well as I would like, and that I can develop in the context of this PhD, this postdoc. So like, I think if you have a clear vision of these three things, you'll be more than busy. And that should give a very clear structure, because like the stuff that you still need to acquire as skills is also the thing that structures who you're going to ask for what during your postdoc. Who are you going to work with? Who are you, for instance, do you want to run to the dean of the faculty and ask whether there are workshop support options for this or that? Or is this more something where you want to talk with collaborators and try and get like pick their brains? What is it that you really need? But it's important that you kind of keep all these things in mind at the same time, because if you forget one of them, like if you don't do the stuff you're doing now, by the time of the end of your postdoc, your CV will look exactly the same as it does now, which means you're not in a good position to move on. If you forget the plan for afterwards, then basically you may have a wonderful experience as a postdoc, but then you fall into the void. And this void is not a good place to be, right? So like, this is kind of, I think, the main three dimensions that I would keep track of. Okay, what else do I see? I see from David, you're planning another postdoc? Okay, so how can you?
Let me say that I wish I could be in this kind of position and experience again a postdoc. It's such an exciting opportunity, also for the family, I think. And I wish I could do it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some very, very rewarding things about it, and there are some kind of slightly frustrating ones, I guess. Like in terms of like relation with mentor supervisors, I don't know. Like I'm not sure whether I'm the best expert on that matter, because I wouldn't say that I really mastered this. I can maybe say a few things that a few stupid things that I think would make sense avoiding, and maybe a few strategies that I took from this. One thing is like supervisors and mentors are people, and they have brainwaves that aren't always transparent to you, right? Like spending some time to try and figure out what is important to them is a very well invested time. And that includes sometimes finding out what their bad habits are. Like I found out about some bad habits of my boss as a postdoc a little bit too late. And that got me into a lot of trouble. The skill that I then developed from this, and there's basically one skill that I think is useful generally, even if you have really nice mentors or supervisors, is to develop a skill to keep them a bit at bay. That's generally a useful thing, right? Like you want to be able to pull them closer to you if you feel they're too far, and you want to be able to keep them a bit farther away if with their ideas and suggestions of what you're now supposed to do next, they're a little bit overbearing. So kind of finding, like establishing a routine, for instance, and that may differ immensely depending on who you are and how you work and how they work. But like establishing a routine that gives you enough freedom to do your own thinking, but at the same time still conveys to your supervisor, mentor, that you are committed, and that you don't want to get across this impression that you don't want them around, right? And then basically the nuances depend very much on the personality. Some people love it if people are completely independent and only come with progress reports every now and then. Some people hate that and they want to be involved in things. So I think that would be kind of the most important thing I would probably advise, is to try and figure out how they tick a little bit. And that doesn't mean that you have to humor all of that, but it gives a kind of like a problem definition for what you want to solve. Like if you get the sense that they want to be much more involved in your work than you feel comfortable at, then finding a way of keeping them, giving them the feeling that they are involved while at the same time kind of maintaining your freedom might be a key skill. if you get the sense that they actually might be the kind of people who disappear into the world and forget about you, and that's not what you want, I mean, maybe that's what you want, who knows, right? Then you might want to establish a routine for like being in contact, right? Like just kind of like some kind of either like meetings or reporting, or like maybe try, like for some people it's a good idea to start a paper that you write together, and for some people that's exactly the thing that dooms you, right? Like I thankfully avoided writing a paper together with my supervisor in Munich, because I know I would have gone crazy if I had done this. But there are cases where this is a really good strategy. So I think that's basically the long answer here. Get a good understanding of how you work, get a good understanding of what they do and how that is compatible or incompatible with what you do, and find strategies to foster. Like you have to educate your boss, right? Like they always do, everybody always. And if you can't educate them, you have to manage them, which may mean that you may need to create situations for them to come in, even though they didn't really feel like it. And sometimes that may be developing strategies for keeping them out of your bloody office. And that can be very useful, right? And the rest is really personality based. Like some people are super personal and close and friendly and have this kind of, after many years, like go to birthday parties with their supervisors. I'm not like this, I don't like this. So I never really felt the need to develop this, but this is for you to decide, and for them, like this is basically to negotiate in this relationship. Okay, what else do I see? I see, how can we link our current PhD stage with a postdoc stage that will come later? Well, that's kind of, I think, to some extent, the link between where you stand, like what you, like basically what you have already done and what this is good for, right? I mean, like there is the exceptional situation that you decide to do your post, to basically end your topic with your PhD. I know a few people who have done this. And like, if you want to, if you decided by now that you basically hate your topic of your PhD, this is now the moment to abandon it. Don't do this later. Yeah? But if you don't want to abandon this, then there is always something that follows from your PhD that is either an open question, or it is a particular skill that you developed, or an approach that you developed, or it is kind of like a generalization that one would need to further, like implications that one would need to test. And that's basically how I would probably go about this, to kind of think, what of the things that I have learned and done in the past do I want to continue on, and why? And that may be very different things in your thesis. That may be that basically your thesis is just like the foundation brick, and you want to build on this, and the entire thesis, the entire thing that you did is something that builds a foundation of what you will continue. Maybe your thesis was just an application of an idea that you had, and you're going to completely abandon the case and the context, but this idea you want to continue on. Maybe the thesis was a testing ground for developing a tool, or like some kind of strategy, and that's what you want to continue on. But this is kind of how I would think about it. What of the things that you have done do you want to continue on, and why? And then tell the story this way, right? Like put this thing that you want to continue with center stage, explain how the winding road got you to this thing, and explain how having this thing now enables you to do things that others might not be able to do quite in the same way, or might benefit from you having you around that you're doing this. Okay, Lena asks, what points should we take into consideration when talking about expectations with a postdoc supervisor? That depends a little bit on what is the context of your postdoc. If you're doing a postdoc that is really an independent postdoc, where they hire you to do your thing, like with a supervisor that is interested in a topic, but it's really like your thing, then I would really focus on explaining like how you can make this time count for your big agenda. right? Like how you will progress, how you will develop, how you will turn this development into publications, into demonstrable outcomes, which don't have to be publications, but very often they will be. Could also be grant application, could also be a teaching program, could also be, it can be a lot of things, but like how will you use this time in order to generate stuff that is valuable? That is not necessarily the wisest strategy if your postdoc is in a project. Then the supervisor will be very much interested in how you are going to work toward that project. And in this case, what I would probably focus on is the synergies, like the things that you can do within the project, so they will be interested in it, but that are simultaneously also getting you forward on your quest, so you are interested in this, right? But there I would still kind of talk about like generating outcomes and measurable activities, not just kind of stuff that you do and then know, but like how you can make this useful for other people and measurable. But I would not necessarily run first with how this gets you forward, because that's not currently their main problem. The story is more like how you will grow as an effect of being part of this project while contributing valuably to meeting this project objectives. If you're doing this, if you remember the talk I did on the slide, in this recording, if you do this the continental European style, that you get hired by somebody as like a staff position somewhere, then this is a little bit halfway. Because on the one hand, technically, these are not project positions. So you're not supposed to contribute to one particular project, but what is important is that you, on this thing, you develop your own profile, and you need to talk about this. But at the same time, the people normally then put you into a chair, and you need to contribute to that chair. So like just like my example, I was at a chair for strategic communication, which translates into public relations. I personally don't give a fuck about public relations, right? Like, I know this is a wonderful, interesting subject for other people, but I don't care. So what my narrative then was that I said, like, political communication is strategic. People do say things politically for a reason. They don't just, okay, some are stupid and do say things accidentally, but mostly this is strategic. So basically you frame what you want to do in such a way that they understand how this fits. And that's important, because if they can't see how this fits, they will very quickly get frustrated with this, right? There is the exception. There are every now and then these kind of kings and queens who are super open-minded and just want you to do cool things, whatever these are. And then you have to obviously convey how what you're doing is cool. But the default case is that they will want to understand how this fits into the context of their unit, their research team, their chair, their broader research agenda. So like you need to negotiate between these two things. I see Hagid asks the relationship with a supervisor, my experience about mentoring PhD student and postdoc. Okay, and I'll go first and David chips in after that, maybe? Like,
yeah.
Okay, like what I would say, okay, like with mentoring postdocs, I don't have that many years of experience, but I've had, like, basically my first PhD students are now in your position, right? Like one of them is already officially with a degree, 2 more are getting ready. And I have to say that this was, in all of those cases, and is with the others, very different, because every person is different. Like, I don't know, like, I know that other people do it otherwise, but also because 2 of my PhD students are not here, but they're in Germany. This entire mentoring experience was very different. What I found very important is to early on find a way that works for both me and for them to maintain communications. And I can't say that this is easy. Like one of my students is brilliant and doing super fascinating stuff, and I'm always finding out too late. and it annoys the hell out of me. And you know, like there's all these things where I think like this, I could have helped you get this from really nice to amazing if you had asked, if you had told me in time. So like kind of, I think, and that's a lesson that I'm taking out of my own inability to do this so far, like to establish a kind of a routine of being in contact, of checking base, what's going on. And that may be extremely different in frequency depending on who you are and how you work. But this is something that I find important, and I regret that I didn't do this in time in all of the cases. And then there's kind of another thing that I find is very important is to be clear about what you expect them to do. Like what if you supervise people, what you expect them to do independently, and what are the kind of things where you expect them to touch base. Because there is like often, this is often not clear. When I was a PhD student, this wasn't difficult for me because my supervisor was very clear about what he expected me to do independently, which is basically my PhD. But like, you know, he was like, his policy was always, if you have a question, come. If you don't have a question, have fun. And if that's your attitude, that's fine, but you need to be clear about that, because people will not necessarily read this in the tea leaves. So I think like clarifying expectations is important. That also goes for clarifying expectations in terms of quality and like, you know, what can you get away with? So like, you know, like I've had a few interactions with students I supervised where I felt like, you know, like you could know that this is not gonna fly. But apparently I wasn't quite clear enough about this. So basically, like, what do I expect from them? And also listen to what do they, like, how do they work? And you can't really ask them what they expect from you, because it doesn't really work like this. There is too much power in this relationship, too much power differential to ask this openly. You will never get like an answer that is really exhaustive and useful. And this is probably also the case, like, you know, if you now have like as a postdoc, you have a bit more of a position to speak from, but if there is this senior, big shot, whatever, and they ask you, what do you expect from me? You probably will not verbalize everything that is on your mind that you hope for. But like that's, I think, a thing that's important, to listen attentively and to kind of create spaces where both the supervisor and the supervisee can convey things that they are not currently happy with, without this becoming personal, because that's terrible, right? Like if you have a supervision relationship and at some point you get the sense that, you know, like either my supervisee thinks I kind of left them alone, I abandoned them, I'm not standing in for them, or you get the sense as a supervisee, my supervisor is disappointed and doesn't think I can do it. This is not a good situation. So kind of creating spaces where you can listen to one another about your expectations in ways that enables also the weaker side, whether you as a postdoc are on the weaker side toward a supervisor, or whether you're on the stronger side toward a supervisee, but creating spaces where this is like kind of finding informal ways, or like ways of chatting about stuff that have sufficient easiness, sufficient kind of informality. So you allow you create a situation where like you can allude to things, where also the weaker side can allude to things that might not have been quite up to scratch. So you pick this up, try to pick this up, because like you will have to negotiate this with everybody who you work with, both upward and downward. And it really helps if you figure this out early, right? There's not one solution for how to organize this, but it really helps to get a good understanding of how the others tick early on.
So when you think about relations between mentor and mentee, okay, it doesn't matter if it's a PhD, MA, postdoc level, You can think about hierarchical relations, formal relations. I mean, more hierarchical, less hierarchical, more formal, less formal, closer and distance, and all those accesses are really changed according to the interaction. It's your personality you bring into the relation, and the mentor's personality. So it's a matter of your personality, his or her personality, then the discipline, the type of grant. Let me say, I won't expand on this personality, but the type of grant, if the grant is of the supervisor or you have the grant, the money from yourself, you brought the money. The discipline, is it the disciplines where you are writing together or not? This is very important. And then there is an issue, which I want to emphasize, that you are never in a kind of a bilateral relation. It's never you and the mentor. Usually there is an environment, a group of people who are working on the issue closely or less closely. They are in the department, maybe they are not in the department, but they are in the city or town. Maybe those people are kind of a network of scholars, and you can get the expectation and just the expectation, not only in a two-way relations, but in where you are in the network, and you get hints, you get clues, you get understanding of yourself and where you are aiming to in those relations, also from the network and the institution. For example, how many workshops there are in the department, in the research group, how many interaction, how frequent they are. And you ask the people, what are you expected to do and how to behave. You look at others, of course. And even if you don't get a straightforward answer, you still can have a sense and try to read between the lines. So the options are there, but the mentor-mentee relation is something that you work all the way. You can develop them. This is up to you to manage, to nurture, and to get the most of. Most of in terms of your strategic goals, in terms of scientific relations. You want to build relations that will be conductive, useful for better research for yourself and science and the field. So that's my point of view on those issues, and I will let you, Christian, take on from here.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly
I would like to
say...
raise a question, please. Is it possible?
Yeah.
Just first of all, to thank you for this insightful talk. And really, I'm experiencing a lot of things that you just mentioned because I'm abroad. And I wanted to, if you can refer, you talked about the cultural differences. And this is something I'm really experiencing a lot. And for my next destination, I would like to know how much should I bring for myself and how much should I adopt from the local institute? Because sometimes it's, it's not the same.
Yeah, I think to some extent, like, can do this relatively simply. Like, I'm just going to quickly respond to you, Shlomi, and also to the question that Agi and Lena posted in the chat, because they're not that difficult. I think, like, with the cultural differences, it depends on two things. One, do you like it? Two, do you plan to stay? Because like give you an extreme example, a colleague of mine in Amsterdam, when I was there, the German always refused to learn Dutch because he said it's just a dialect. I mean, you can see how, like, if you're just there for like 3 years, that might be an attitude that you might have, but you can imagine how that was received by the Dutch, right? That's a very fast and simple way to not connect to the department. So, so basically, if you are really only working with a team and then you're moving on and you don't have any intention to grow roots or whatever, you can afford to kind of be a little bit, like you say, I wouldn't say asshole, but there's something asshole-ish about it. But it's like, it's to some extent, it's a self-preservation, right? That you don't kind of expose yourself to the full blow of the cultural differences, but you kind of keep a little bit in your bubble, expat bubble. If you want to make the most out of this, I would generally recommend to at least do some compromise. I don't think that it ever makes sense to give up yourself. I've been here now for 6 years and I'm still very German. And I'm still kind of bitching about the fact that there is not a single fucking house in the country that has tight windows. And this is really, really annoying. But like at the same time, there are a lot of ways in which you, of course, do acquire. Like it's always something that sticks. And I think the strategy is to kind of find your blend that you like. Like take over habits, take over attitudes that you relate to, that kind of talk to you. And you don't have to kind of change yourselves, but use it as an opportunity to grow. With regarding to the expectations toward PhD students, but toward postdocs that Agi posted, I think the short answer is, on the whole, normally postdocs are not really expected to do that much, but it is often in your interest to do a little bit beyond expectations. So like, you're not normally, for instance, you're not normally supposed to be part of department work, department committees. This is not normally your job. This is not like, you're not expected to be sociable with everybody. And I would actually probably like this can also look weird if you're too much like embracing everybody. Depends a bit on the department culture. If it's a small department and they're very close, join that thing, become part of it, and see how much this gets reciprocated. If it's a department that is more like kind of compartmentalized, try and find your buddies, try and build your personal connections. But what was maybe useful to know is that there are a few mines that you can step on accidentally. So like, for instance, if you're in a big department and there are these kind of 7 people that you are really friendly with, and you have this kind of, like, you start inviting and you start becoming this part of the group, that can look like you are basically dividing, or like basically you like, I don't know, I got into this problem at some point because I had to have this habit of inviting people. And then at some point, some people who got not invited because they were not close to me, I didn't really speak much with them, felt like, you know, I'm kind of excluding them. So like, I think the general strategy probably is to, unless you know that this is okay and that the entire department, you're good with being friendly with the entire department, to be, to keep it to a level where it's mostly bilateral or like small groups, but you don't start having like a friends group that consists of 60% of the department. That might look weird, right? But I don't think like on a whole, I think you're normally generally okay to not get very much invested in the university department, in the in also in personal relationships as a postdoc. That's not something that you are expected to do. It's more like a thing that you can do in order to extract more life quality for yourself and also more kind of collaboration, more network. But then go about this selectively and don't think of this as something that you have to do, right? Like if there are 5 people in your department that you don't like, that's okay. That's completely okay. You're not part of that department in the way that you have to humor everybody. The funding, that makes a difference. If you come on somebody else's funds, who pays has a legitimate point in telling you that you got hired for something. If you bring your own funding, if you have Marie Curie, to some extent, you can really say fuck off. And I'm not recommending doing this generally, but sometimes there are situations where this is good to know, that basically if you come with your own money and you have your own kind of like collaborations that are coming into your work because of your grant, that became possible because of your grant, and somebody doesn't really like this, you still want to make sure that the people you work with at the department are good and are happy. But if then there is somebody who comes and asks you to do something, or like, wonders why you're not giving this talk and this thing and you don't feel like it, you can afford to say no. If this is the person who pays your bills, think very hard before you say no, right? And which doesn't mean you can't do this, but it means that you want to prepare this a bit. You want to have a good reason why this is currently not a good idea. And if they think about it a little bit, it is not in their interest that you do this now. You can always argue this, right? If the, whatever, the PI in your project that kind of hired you says like, yeah, why don't you submit to this kind of conference and you really don't feel like it? Like if it's just an offhand suggestion, you can say like, yeah, I don't really feel like it. But if it comes back the second time, start finding reasons why it is also not on your PI's interest to do this, because you have other priorities or something like this, right? So especially if you're in a project that has a purpose, that purpose is master. And you can't easily disregard this. That doesn't mean that you have to do everything for that master. But that means that this purpose of the project does have a legitimate right to interfere with your work. If you're at a chair with somebody, you have a little bit more freedom, but the continental European system is such that your existence, or like your staying in that job, depends on your boss being happy. So if you're not planning on staying, you can afford them being unhappy. If you're planning on staying, if you want to do this other year, then don't do this too much. Right? This is a little bit of negotiating the politics and the power relationships, but if you have if you bring your own money, you have a much stronger position in saying like, like in the next 2 months, I was planning on working on this. I'll do this afterwards, and nobody can really complain because you brought your own money, right? Like, so let me very quickly just see what there is still. I have 2 more questions.
Kiristian, I'm sorry, I just want to add to this mix that these people are still, there is a very clear power difference.
Yeah.
We will go back to ask them for recommendation letters. And this is something I constantly keep thinking about. This is my own money. But the person who is supervising me is a big shot in the field. This is one of the reasons that I partner up with them to do this postdoc. And I need them to think well of me. So, when she asks me to do something, I think very well about how I reply this, because in a year from now, I'll need her letters to get moving forward. So it's really, really, really tricky.
It is tricky. I think the base strategy really is always to find project imminent reasons for why you have to or cannot do this, right? Like if basically, because like there is like your project is to some extent your master. So if you can, if there is this thing that you really need to get done in the next, 3 weeks, and this is just not combinable with what they just currently ask, don't flat out refuse and say like, no, I'm not going to do this, and say something like, okay, like the thing is like, I'm trying to really get this thing done because this will be really important also for the visibility of this project and for what we are doing here. So like, this is going to be, this has to be my priority number 1. And if it, like, I can see if I can somehow squeeze this in, but like the cost for this will really be that I won't have much time to prepare for this under the circumstances. I'm not convinced that this is really worth it, but if you say, I really should, this is important, then I'll consider this, right? Like something like this, something that kind of gives a reason that is not like I don't want to, but like there are priorities here that you and I agree on, and these priorities dictate that I have to do something in the way that I like it, right? This is much better, like as a reason than saying like, no, I don't really feel like it. If you can say, if you can find reasons why what they ask you to do conflicts with something that they also asked you to do. Or if it conflicts with something that you both know will have to be done and it is really important. And to some extent, you can pull self-interest as a reason, right? You can say like, you know, like I really need to get this thing out. I need to get this thing published in the next month because this is like my kind of further career that depends on it. So I'm going to try and like, normally the best rhetoric is to kind of, to just sound like, you are seriously trying to comply with what they're doing, but unfortunately, under the circumstances, this is not really possible, right? If you can pull it off like this, then you get away with a lot of no's. But this is difficult, exactly like Hagit said. This is not an easy thing to do. Let me, because we're sort of out of time, just very quickly read the remaining chat that we have here. Yeah, the American versus continental European system, it is a difficult thing. Like basically what you, I think the main thing, there's two things. One is you need to explain. So like for instance, when I applied here, I had like something like, I don't know, like 50 supervisions of a thesis on my scoreboard, which all technically aren't mine. Because like obviously my boss did all those things, but this is not like, this is like if you send a CV from that you built at a continental European university to one that exists in an Americanized system, they don't necessarily always see what that is, which means that your cover letter and the way in which you present your CV is really important. You need to translate and you need to explain things that aren't transparent. Don't just assume that just because you list all the things that you did, everybody will understand what that means, right? So like keep a little bit in mind that the other system might be a little bit different. And then the other thing is that you need to some extent already anticipate the logic. Like if you want to move from one system into the other, you need to anticipate that it has a different logic. American systems, for instance, give way more weight to impact factors. And if you do research in France, in Germany, in Italy, you might actually get away with quite a lot of publications that are not impact factors, and that's a problem. So while you're doing this, you need to have in the back of your mind that you're actually considering going back to a system in which this will count. So if next time somebody comes and says like, I'm having this book, wouldn't you like to write this chapter? Then either find I would really like to do this, however, it's not possible in order to not do this, or find a way so you can use writing this chapter as a test run for the article, which you will then actually publish, but you need to publish that article. Just because within the French system, that is not necessarily required. But if you want to get out of the French system, again, you will need to publish that article. You need to keep this in mind. So this is a translation rule that you need to do if you're aware of those two things. Okay, being a postdoc fellow is another message in a direct message. Okay, yeah. I think I already kind of spoke to this. So like maybe like since we're out of chat and out of time, my email address is easy to find on the Hebrew University's web pages if they're currently running. If as an outcome of this, there's something that is kind of burning under your fingers and you really want to have an answer, whatever you think, like you know, like you have a question that wasn't answered or you run into a concrete problem, feel free to email me. I can't always guarantee that I'll write immediately or that necessarily everything I write will be exactly what you were hoping for. But unless now everybody of you is writing me 3 emails, I should be able and happy to do this. So feel free to ask. Have a lot of fun, because that's important, right? Like if we stop having fun doing research, then we need to stop doing this. This is important. Not everything is always fun, but on the whole, it must be fun. Otherwise, it's not worth it. And try and stay safe. try and have a as happy Pesach as is possible. Chag Sameach, everybody, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.